In the heart of a quiet neighborhood, where kids rode their bikes and families held weekend barbecues, there was one man no one really noticed. He lived just down the street, a shadow among familiar faces. But behind those closed doors, hidden in plain sight, a nightmare was unfolding. For years, a killer lurked among them, a man who preyed on vulnerable women while escaping detection. A man who would only be stopped when one young girl, against all odds, broke free. How could a predator operate in secret for so long, living right next to unsuspecting families? This is the story of Bobby Joe Long, a man whose horrific crimes rocked Tampa, Florida. A man who slipped under the radar for years, murdering women and leaving no trace. How did he manage to evade justice while hiding in plain sight, living among everyday people? And what finally led to his downfall? In every town, on every street, there's that one house, the one you pass by without a second glance. A house where the blinds are always drawn, and the lights flicker on only in the dead of night. But in Tampa, Florida, back in the 1980s, one such house held secrets darker than anyone could have imagined. The man who lived there, Bobby Joe Long, wasn't just another neighbor. Behind those walls, Long was hiding a twisted, deadly obsession, targeting vulnerable women, killing them, and leaving a trail of bodies across the city. He walked among people every day, grocery shopped next to them, waved at neighbors, all while harboring a darkness that would eventually come to light in the most horrific of ways. But how did he manage to stay hidden for so long? How did Bobby Joe Long commit his heinous acts, all while maintaining the guise of a regular man living in the suburbs? What allowed him to evade capture for so many months, even as the bodies piled up? This is the story of how a serial killer hid in plain sight, living right next to unsuspecting families, and how one courageous survivor's escape led to his downfall. In May 1984, the body of 20-year-old Artis and Wick was found in a desolate area near Tampa, Florida. Wick, a sex worker, was discovered in a gruesome state, beaten, strangled, and left in a position that suggested a deliberate display by her killer. To the community and even the investigators, her death seemed like an isolated tragedy, just another brutal crime in a dangerous world. The local authorities, however, had little to work with. Wick's line of work and the violent way she was killed provided few clues that pointed to a suspect. Tampa's law enforcement at the time wasn't yet seeing a pattern. They viewed it as an unfortunate but not uncommon case in the gritty underworld of the city. The media, too, treated the case as another tragic death of a marginalized woman, failing to draw any real public attention. But beneath the surface, this was just the beginning. It was the first clue that something much darker was happening, a storm brewing that no one could yet see. In those early days, police did little to connect Wick's murder to anything larger. The brutality of the crime wasn't lost on detectives, but it didn't seem to fit into any larger puzzle at the time. Unfortunately, sex workers in the Tampa area were frequently subjected to violence, and their cases often went cold. The public, too, barely raised an eyebrow. To them, this was an unfortunate tragedy, but it didn't represent a wider threat. However, within weeks, a pattern would emerge, a pattern so dark that it would grip the city in fear. By June 1984, another body was discovered. This time, it was a young woman named Njunti Long, her body found strangled and beaten in a similar manner to Wick. This wasn't a random act of violence anymore. Two women, both found dead, both sex workers, both killed in an eerily similar way. For the first time, police began to consider that these killings might be connected. As the summer months passed, the bodies kept surfacing. Michelle Sims, a 22-year-old who had also been abducted, was discovered along a rural road. The killer's brutality was escalating. She was bound and gagged, her body bearing signs of prolonged torture. The similarities between the cases became harder to ignore. Each victim was abducted, killed, and left in isolated areas, discarded like garbage, as if their lives had meant nothing to the person who took them. The press finally began to take notice, and whispers of a serial killer in Tampa started to circulate. Police, too, were starting to see the horrifying truth. This wasn't a random killer. This was a calculated predator, choosing his victims with care and dispatching them with ruthless efficiency. As the summer wore on, the death toll continued to rise, with each new body bringing the city closer to full-blown panic. Despite the growing number of victims, Bobby Joe Long remained invisible, his crimes hidden in plain sight. Neighbors and acquaintances would later report having seen him many times but had noticed nothing unusual. Long's demeanor was unremarkable, he was quiet, kept to himself, and lived an otherwise inconspicuous life. He did not appear suspicious to those around him. One witness, a woman living on Long Street, would recall seeing him drive late at night but thought nothing of it. Another neighbor mentioned that Long seemed normal, polite even. He had children, dated women, and worked various odd jobs. He fit in. Long was the perfect predator, hiding in the open, using his ordinary appearance as camouflage for the atrocities he was committing. By September 1984, Tampa was gripped by terror. The once peaceful neighborhoods were now haunted by the fear that a killer was lurking just around the corner. Women, particularly sex workers, began disappearing regularly. Bodies were being discovered in fields, behind dumpsters, and near construction sites. As more details of the crimes emerged, fear and paranoia spread like wildfire. The police had no concrete leads. Each new murder seemed to follow the same pattern, yet they were no closer to catching the killer. Citizens started locking their doors at night. Women were afraid to walk alone, even in the daytime. Rumors swirled about a man stalking the streets, targeting the vulnerable. But no one knew who it was or when he might strike next. The media, now fully tuned in, stoked the fear. Headlines screamed of a Tampa Bay serial killer, and news anchors warned women to stay vigilant. Investigators were under immense pressure, but the clues were sparse, and the killer was clever. There were no fingerprints, no clear motive, and no suspect. It seemed like he could vanish just as easily as he had appeared. Then, in November 1984, the unthinkable happened. Lisa McVeigh, a 17-year-old girl riding her bike home from work, was abducted by Bobby Joe Long. For over 26 hours, Long held her captive, repeatedly assaulting her in his home. But McVeigh was unlike Long's other victims. She had a sharp mind and an incredible will to survive. Despite being blindfolded, she left fingerprints wherever she could, noted small details about Long's home, and memorized his voice. In a miraculous turn of events, Long let McVeigh go, without knowing or thinking she would have left some details of evidence around his house. She immediately reported the abduction to the police, providing them with detailed information that would lead to Long's capture. McVeigh's bravery broke the case wide open, and within days, Long was arrested. The DNA evidence, along with the fibers and witness testimonies McVeigh had provided, were enough to convict him. The chilling escalation of Bobby Joe Long's crimes, the brutal pattern of abductions, the terror that gripped the community, and the fearless escape of Lisa McVeigh, marked the end of Long's reign of terror. He was finally unmasked, and the city of Tampa could breathe again. The Tampa police were initially overwhelmed by the mounting number of murders. Each new body that was discovered only added to the pressure, and yet, the leads were frustratingly sparse. Lack of leads became the defining feature of the investigation. The first victims, sex workers, often didn't have strong ties to the community, and their disappearances weren't reported immediately, which delayed the police's ability to track their last known movements. One of the primary challenges was the lack of physical evidence. Bobby Joe Long, though ruthless in his killings, left behind almost no tangible clues that could directly connect him to the crime scenes. He meticulously cleaned up after himself, and his victims were often left in remote locations, making it difficult for investigators to link the cases at first. As the bodies continued to surface, the police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but with no fingerprints or DNA linking the killer to the crime, they were stuck. The killer's precision and ability to blend into the background made him virtually invisible to authorities. As Detective Larry Pinkerton, one of the lead investigators, later described it, "We had a ghost on our hands." False leads began to frustrate the investigation. In their desperation to find the killer, police followed several wrong leads. At one point, a local man was arrested after being linked to one of the crime scenes by a vague witness description. This turned out to be a major dead end, and with every false lead, the investigation stalled. These misidentifications delayed the real hunt for Bobby Joe Long, allowing him to continue his deadly spree without interference. The investigation hit a crucial roadblock when police couldn't tie the victims to a single suspect. The women were from different parts of town, with different backgrounds, and many lived transient lifestyles, making it difficult for detectives to piece together a coherent pattern beyond their gender and the violent way in which they were murdered. Meanwhile, Bobby Joe Long was aware of the media frenzy his murders were causing. Newspapers ran headlines about the Tampa Bay Killer, and reporters speculated about the motives and identity of the murderer. Long relished this attention but also grew more cautious. He altered his patterns slightly, varying the way he disposed of bodies and shifting between different areas of the city. This clever adaptation made it even harder for police to anticipate his next move. One particular case in late August 1984 led detectives down yet another frustrating path. A woman's body was discovered in a secluded area with few signs of struggle. Police initially believed her death was unrelated to the serial killer but quickly realized they were wrong when the coroner reported she had been strangled in the same way as the others. By the time they connected the dots, Long had already abducted and killed his next victim, further throwing the investigation into disarray. The tension in the community was palpable. Fear had turned to paranoia, as women no longer felt safe walking the streets at night, and many speculated that the killer could be anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, even someone in the police force itself. The public demanded answers, but the more the police investigated, the more elusive the killer seemed to become. Long's ability to evade capture for so long was, in part, due to his calculated movements and choice of victims, but also because he never fit the stereotypical image of a murderer. By early November 1984, investigators finally caught a break. A few small details from witnesses began to point to a possible suspect, though the clues were subtle and far from definitive. Bobby Joe Long had already been on the police radar for unrelated crimes, including sexual assaults in other cities, but he wasn't immediately considered a primary suspect in the Tampa murders. Long had a troubling history of violence toward women, including a long list of sexual assaults across Florida and California, but his transient lifestyle had made it difficult for law enforcement agencies to track his movements and connect his various crimes. It wasn't until Lisa McVeigh, a 17-year-old girl, was abducted and then miraculously escaped Long's clutches, that the police began to zero in on him. Even with Lisa McVeigh's harrowing testimony, the police were not ready to arrest Long. Her account was disturbing but incomplete. She had been blindfolded for much of her captivity and couldn't provide a full description of her abductor. Still, the police took her claims seriously and started digging into men who matched the vague description McVeigh had provided. Just as they were getting closer, another body was found, sending the investigation in a new direction, this one seemingly unrelated to Long. At this critical moment, investigators faced a choice: pursue the new lead or continue building the case against Long, whose guilt was not yet confirmed. The investigation had reached a turning point, with Long remaining one step ahead while police struggled to piece together the web of violence he had woven across Tampa. The police investigation into the Tampa Bay serial murders had been plagued by dead ends and false leads for months. As each new victim was found, the pressure on law enforcement mounted, but the breakthrough they needed seemed elusive, until November 1984, when Lisa McVeigh's brave escape provided the turning point. On November 3, 1984, after enduring a harrowing 26-hour ordeal at the hands of Bobby Joe Long, 17-year-old McVeigh managed to convince him to release her. Despite being blindfolded for most of her captivity, McVeigh had kept her wits about her. She paid close attention to the details she could sense: sounds, smells, and the texture of the interior of Long's car. She even managed to leave her fingerprints on various surfaces in his bathroom in case the police ever found her. McVeigh was dropped off alive, and within hours, she had reported her kidnapping to the police. Lisa McVeigh's testimony proved invaluable. She recalled a unique red carpet in the car Long drove, noted the sounds of a nearby railroad track as they entered his house, and described the texture of his skin. More importantly, she was able to give investigators a description of the man and the location of her abduction. From this critical information, detectives were finally able to narrow their search to Bobby Joe Long. Using McVeigh's details, police identified Long's vehicle, a 1978 Dodge Magnum, which was spotted during a neighborhood sweep. This would be the key clue that would finally lead to Long's arrest. Forensic evidence collected from his car and home would later connect him definitively to the string of brutal murders. On November 16, 1984, Bobby Joe Long was arrested without incident in a Tampa movie theater parking lot, marking the end of his reign of terror. The discovery that Bobby Joe Long, a seemingly ordinary man, was responsible for the string of murders sent shockwaves through the Tampa community. Long had lived a relatively low-profile life in the area. He had a history of relationships with women, children, and even maintained a job. On the surface, he appeared to be a normal member of society, which made the revelation of his double life as a serial killer all the more shocking. Neighbors were astounded to learn that the quiet man who lived nearby was behind the gruesome killings. A neighbor later remarked, "He seemed normal, just like any other guy on the block. I never would have suspected him of something like this." The sense of betrayal that followed his arrest rippled throughout Tampa. Even those who knew Long from his past couldn't reconcile the man they thought they knew with the cold-blooded murderer the police had apprehended. Detectives who worked the case were equally stunned. Detective Larry Pinkerton, who had spent months chasing dead-end leads, admitted that the arrest was both a relief and a shock. "We'd been hunting this guy for months. The last thing we expected was for him to be someone who blended in so easily." The revelation that the killer had been living so close to his victims, hiding in plain sight, rattled everyone involved. As the investigation unfolded, police began to uncover the modus operandi of Bobby Joe Long's chilling spree of murders. He specifically targeted vulnerable women, many of whom were sex workers or women in precarious situations, making them easier targets. Long would abduct his victims, often from isolated areas, and then subject them to brutal torture, rape, and ultimately, murder. After killing them, he would dump their bodies in secluded locations, ensuring that they would not be found immediately. Long's method of operation revealed a man who took pleasure in domination and control. He often sought to dehumanize his victims before killing them, treating them as objects rather than people. His cruelty knew no bounds, and his consistency across his victims indicated a well-developed pattern of behavior. This cold, methodical approach made him especially dangerous. In the aftermath of his arrest, criminal psychologists were called in to assess the mindset of Bobby Joe Long. His life, it turned out, had been marked by trauma and violence from an early age. Born in 1953, Long suffered from a condition known as Klinefelter syndrome, which gave him an extra X chromosome, leading to hormonal imbalances that affected his behavior and development. He endured a troubled childhood, marked by a close but deeply dysfunctional relationship with his mother, and this dysfunction would lay the groundwork for his later violent tendencies. According to psychologists, Long's hatred of women was deeply ingrained. It manifested in his sexual crimes, which began with a series of rapes before escalating into full-fledged serial murder. Experts like Dr. Robert Hare, who studied psychopathy, noted that Long exhibited classic signs of a psychopath: complete lack of empathy, grandiosity, and a pathological need for control. Long himself would later confess to a string of rapes committed in the early 1980s, explaining that they had given him a sense of power and control that he craved. However, it was his inability to satisfy this craving that led him to murder. His violent behavior escalated, reaching a peak with his killing spree in 1984. The combination of a deeply troubled psychological profile and the opportunity to exploit vulnerable women created the perfect storm that allowed Bobby Joe Long to terrorize Tampa for months. The discovery of Bobby Joe Long's true identity as the serial killer shocked Tampa's citizens and law enforcement alike. His seemingly ordinary life, coupled with his horrifying crimes, illustrated the complex nature of serial killers and their ability to blend into everyday life, often hiding in plain sight until they are finally unmasked. The arrest of Bobby Joe Long came on November 16, 1984, following Lisa McVeigh's escape and the crucial evidence she provided to police. After being tracked down in his car, Long was arrested in a Tampa movie theater parking lot. The arrest, while non-violent, was charged with tension, as the officers involved knew they were apprehending one of the most prolific and dangerous killers in Florida's history. Long, who had no idea the police were closing in on him, was caught off guard. When officers approached, they found him without resistance, almost as if he had expected this day would come eventually. The community, having lived in terror for months, reacted with collective shock and relief. Local newspapers ran headlines about the Tampa Bay serial killer, and the sense of relief that swept through the area was palpable. Long had not only killed at least 10 women but also perpetrated a reign of terror through numerous rapes, many of which had gone unsolved for years. Long's trial was one of the most high-profile cases in Florida's history. Courtroom drama unfolded during the trial, particularly during the harrowing testimonies from the victims' families, who spoke about the deep grief and loss they suffered. The emotional weight of the trial was immense, with many people eager for justice. Lisa McVeigh, whose escape ultimately led to Long's arrest, also testified. Her powerful testimony moved the courtroom as she detailed her kidnapping and Long's calculated cruelty during her time in captivity. Bobby Joe Long, however, showed little remorse. Throughout the trial, he remained cold and detached, his lack of emotion only heightening the horror for those following the proceedings. Criminal psychologists who testified during the trial explained that Long exhibited traits of psychopathy, which included a complete inability to empathize with his victims. The evidence against Long was overwhelming, particularly after he confessed to several of the murders and rapes. His confession was seen as a chilling moment in the trial, where he nonchalantly detailed his crimes without any visible sign of regret. Detectives recalled that his admissions were matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion, as though he were discussing trivial details rather than human lives. In the end, Long was sentenced to death for the murder of Michelle Sims, one of his 10 known victims. He also received multiple life sentences for the other murders and rapes. Long's case garnered widespread media attention, with many calling for swift justice. Public opinion was largely in favor of his death sentence, given the brutality of his crimes. The revelation that a serial killer had lived among them shook the Tampa Bay community to its core. Many residents expressed shock and disbelief that someone like Bobby Joe Long could operate so close to home for so long without being caught. Some neighbors had seen him around and thought nothing of his unremarkable appearance. One local resident recalled, "He was just this guy that kept to himself. I never imagined he was capable of doing something like this." Neighborhood reactions were filled with fear and relief. Fear lingered as people reckoned with the idea that a killer had blended so seamlessly into their everyday lives, but there was also a deep sense of relief that he had finally been caught. In interviews conducted in the aftermath of his arrest, many residents spoke about how they would never look at their neighbors the same way again. There was a collective reevaluation of safety in the community, especially among women who had been living in constant fear for months. The long-term effects of the case were profound. The case prompted changes in how local law enforcement handled cases of missing persons, particularly when it came to women in vulnerable situations, such as sex workers. The police faced criticism for not connecting the murders sooner, and the investigation led to reforms in how the Tampa police approached serial killings. Many of the changes centered around faster communication between jurisdictions and a more coordinated approach when investigating disappearances that shared similar characteristics. Additionally, the emotional scars left by Bobby Joe Long's crimes persisted long after his capture. For many residents, especially those living in the areas where the bodies were found, it took years to shake the fear and paranoia that had gripped the community during the killer's spree. Victims' families and survivors like Lisa McVeigh became outspoken advocates for victims of violent crime, working to ensure that the horror they experienced would not be forgotten. This marked the end of Bobby Joe Long's reign of terror, but his case continues to stand as a chilling reminder of the danger posed by those who can blend so easily into society while harboring dark and violent secrets. It is also a testament to the bravery of victims like Lisa McVeigh, whose courage in the face of unimaginable horror helped bring a killer to justice. Even after Bobby Joe Long's conviction and execution in 2019, there remain lingering unanswered questions surrounding his crimes. One of the most significant is the possibility that there are additional victims beyond the 10 women he was convicted of murdering. Long's brutal spree only came to a halt with his arrest, but given the many unreported cases of sexual violence and the gaps in his timeline, some investigators believe he may have had more victims that were never identified. Further uncertainties also persist regarding Long's motivations. While psychological experts provided insights into his troubled upbringing and the traumatic brain injuries he sustained, many still question what exactly triggered his escalation from serial rapist to serial murderer. What caused this drastic shift? And were there any moments where he could have been stopped earlier? These unanswered aspects of the case continue to spark debate and research into the mind of a killer. As the years have passed, Bobby Joe Long's story has cemented itself as one of the most infamous true crime cases in American history. His crimes and eventual capture have been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and podcasts. Shows like Mindhunter and Criminal Minds have even cited his case as part of their exploration into the psychology of serial killers. Public fascination with the case endures, largely due to the horror of his double life and the fear he instilled in Tampa's tight-knit community. As we reflect on the terrifying crimes of Bobby Joe Long, one pressing question remains: were there more victims who never came forward, or who were never discovered? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think? Did the police catch all of Long's victims, or is there more to this case than what we know today? Be sure to subscribe for more in-depth looks into the most chilling true crime cases. If this story shocked you, you'll definitely want to stay tuned for our next video, where we'll cover another infamous serial killer who used charm and deception to hide a much darker reality. Finally, click on the link to watch our previous episode covering another serial killer who operated for years under the radar, just like Bobby Joe Long.